7 Sinful Handshakes. Samantha was the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. She was beautiful, with long dark hair, piercing green eyes, and a figure that seemed to command attention. But it wasn't just her looks that made her irresistible, it was the way she moved through the world, the way she drew people to her like moths to a flame. She reveled in it, this power she held over others. She thrived on the lustful gazes of men and the envious stares of women. To be desired was everything to her. It wasn't enough to be admired or respected, she needed to be wanted, craved in every possible way. And she knew how to get it. Samantha was always surrounded by people, friends, lovers, admirers, but she never felt close to any of them. They were all just pieces in her game, a game where she was always the center of attention. She flaunted her exploits, casually mentioning the gifts she received from wealthy men, the late-night calls from exes who couldn't forget her, the way she could make anyone bend to her will with just a smile. Her friends, if they could even be called that, were growing tired of it. They had once admired her confidence, but now they saw through the facade. They saw the way she manipulated people, the way she used them to feed her insatiable need to be desired. They began to pull away, one by one, until she was left with only herself. But Samantha never understood why. When her friend Lila finally confronted her, telling her how her behavior was toxic and selfish, Samantha played the victim. She couldn't comprehend how anyone could accuse her of wrongdoing when all she wanted was to be loved, to be needed. She twisted Lila's words, making herself the wounded party, casting her friend as the villain who had wronged her. She continued to do this, with every person who tried to break away from her suffocating grasp. Each time someone left, Samantha found new people to replace them. But the cycle continued: flirt, seduce, flaunt, and then cry foul when they eventually turned on her. She was blind to the truth, unable to see how her lust for desire was driving everyone away. As the years went on, Samantha found herself increasingly alone. The parties became smaller, the gifts less frequent, the calls fewer and farther between. She couldn't understand why her charm seemed to be fading, why people no longer flocked to her like they once did. In the end, Samantha never realized her sin. She never saw how her relentless pursuit of desire had hollowed her out, leaving her with nothing but an empty shell. She remained a prisoner of her own making, forever chasing the attention that would never be enough to fill the void within her. The lust to be desired. To be wanted. Victor Monroe was a man who had it all, at least, that's what he told himself. He was the owner of a successful chain of high-end restaurants, lived in a sprawling penthouse, and drove a car that turned heads wherever he went. He had money, power, and all the luxuries that came with them. But there was one thing he valued above all else: indulgence. Victor reveled in his ability to consume more than anyone around him. Whether it was alcohol, drugs, or expensive meals, he prided himself on being able to afford the best and the most. His days were spent in a haze of pleasure, moving from one indulgence to the next with the same efficiency that had made him a successful businessman. Every night, his penthouse became a playground for excess. He would host lavish parties, pouring top-shelf liquor for his guests and offering them lines of cocaine as casually as he might offer a glass of water. He watched with satisfaction as his friends, family, and even employees took part in the revelry, but he always made sure he was the one who consumed the most. In his mind, it was proof of his superiority, his ability to handle more than anyone else. When people questioned his lifestyle, Victor laughed it off. "I'm high-functioning," he would say, a smug smile on his face. "I run a multi-million-dollar business, don't I? I don't have a problem, I'm just enjoying the fruits of my labor." He loved flaunting his wealth and excess, especially in front of those who couldn't afford the same. He'd often buy rounds of expensive drinks at the bar, making sure everyone knew who was paying. He'd casually mention the cost of his latest purchase, or how much he'd spent on his last party. It wasn't about generosity, it was about showing off, about feeding his gluttony for excess and attention. But Victor's need for more was insatiable. As his consumption increased, so did his dependence. He started drinking earlier in the day, using drugs more frequently, all while maintaining the facade of the successful, high-functioning businessman. He convinced himself that as long as his business thrived, there was no issue. Behind the scenes, though, cracks were forming. His once sharp mind was dulled by the constant barrage of substances, and his decision-making became erratic. His employees began to notice his mood swings, his forgetfulness, the way he sometimes slurred his words during meetings. But Victor ignored the warning signs, dismissing any concerns as jealousy or weakness. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic downfall that caught up with Victor, but a slow unraveling. His gluttony, unchecked and unchallenged, began to consume him from the inside out. The man who prided himself on having it all was left with nothing but the empty satisfaction of knowing he had indulged more than anyone else, even as everything he'd built slowly slipped through his fingers. To be a glutton is punishment by design. Melissa had always been beautiful, a fact she quickly learned to exploit. From a young age, she recognized the power she wielded over men. They wanted her, desired her, and would do anything to be close to her. What started as a game in her teenage years, a way to get what she wanted, soon grew into an insatiable hunger, a greed that consumed her life. By the time she reached her late 20s, Melissa was a master manipulator. She had a string of lovers, each more successful and powerful than the last. CEOs, politicians, artists, no one was beyond her reach. She took what she wanted from each of them: money, gifts, influence, and, most importantly, the thrill of knowing she had them wrapped around her finger. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts from men desperate to see her, to please her, to be in her favor. But no matter how many men she conquered, how many whispered promises she made, or how many she left heartbroken, it was never enough. Each new conquest provided a fleeting rush, a momentary sense of power, but it quickly faded, leaving her craving more. She was addicted to the control, the feeling of being desired, but it was a hunger that could never be satisfied. Melissa's greed wasn't just for the men themselves, but for the influence they gave her. She used their connections to climb social ladders, gaining entry into exclusive circles, securing invitations to the most elite events. Yet, the more she achieved, the emptier she felt. The power she amassed was hollow, built on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. She began to take greater risks, pursuing relationships with married men, playing them against one another, delighting in the chaos she caused. She loved watching them squirm, seeing how far they would go to keep her satisfied. But even this became dull after a while. Her greed was a black hole, growing larger and larger, consuming everything in its path but never feeling full. In her darkest moments, alone in her luxurious apartment, Melissa would stare at herself in the mirror and wonder why she felt so empty. She had everything she thought she wanted: money, power, adoration, but it all felt meaningless. The men she had used and discarded haunted her thoughts, not because she regretted what she had done, but because she realized that no matter how many more she seduced, it would never fill the void inside her. Melissa's life became a cycle of empty seduction and fleeting satisfaction, her greed driving her to exploit anyone who crossed her path. But deep down, she knew she was trapped in her own web, forever chasing something she could never truly possess. The more she took, the less she had, and the emptiness inside her continued to grow, a void that could never be filled. Greed is very exhausting to feed. Derek was once a man of ambition. He had dreams, plans, and a passion for life that fueled his every move. But somewhere along the way, the world beat him down. The constant grind, the endless disappointments, the betrayals by those he trusted, all of it eroded his spirit, leaving him a shell of the person he used to be. Now in his early 40s, Derek had become a man who moved through life with the bare minimum of effort. He woke up each day in his small, cluttered apartment, dragging himself out of bed only because the bills had to be paid. His job was a monotonous grind, data entry for a faceless corporation. He didn't care about the work, didn't care about the company's goals or the paycheck that barely covered his expenses. He showed up because he had to, not because he wanted to. His days were a blur of meaningless tasks, each one draining him a little more. The things he once loved, painting, hiking, reading, were now distant memories, activities from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. His brushes were dusty, his hiking boots untouched, and the books on his shelves were unopened. The fire that once burned in him had long since gone out, leaving only cold ashes behind. In the evenings, Derek would come home, drop onto his couch, and stare blankly at the television. The hours would slip away as he mindlessly watched whatever was on, not really absorbing any of it. His phone would buzz occasionally with messages from old friends, invitations to events, or inquiries about how he was doing, but he ignored them all. He didn't have the energy to respond, didn't see the point in pretending to care. Weekends were no different. Where others might see them as a time to relax and pursue hobbies, Derek saw them as just more days to get through. He slept as much as he could, ate whatever required the least effort, and avoided leaving his apartment unless absolutely necessary. His world had shrunk to the size of those four walls, and he was content to let it stay that way. Derek had resigned himself to a life of idleness. The drive to achieve, to create, to experience had been snuffed out by the weight of his disillusionment. He no longer saw a point in striving for anything, in trying to find meaning or joy. The world had beaten him, and he had given up, choosing instead to simply exist until the day he no longer did. Idle hands strengthen the ties that bind. Clara was always angry. Her rage simmered just beneath the surface, ready to boil over at the slightest provocation. But the truth was, Clara's anger had nothing to do with the people around her. It was rooted deep within herself, born of a profound dissatisfaction with her life and who she had become. She was in her mid-30s, trapped in a job she despised, living in a city that felt cold and indifferent. Her relationships were shallow, strained by her constant need to assert control, to be right, to have the last word. She was miserable, and she couldn't stand to see anyone else happy. Every day at work, Clara seethed as she watched her co-workers chat and laugh, their easy camaraderie grating on her nerves. If one of them dared to approach her desk with a question, she would respond with thinly veiled contempt, her voice laced with sarcasm. She belittled them, pointing out their mistakes with cruel precision, delighting in the way they recoiled under her harsh words. At home, Clara's rage was no different. Her husband, Tom, was often the target of her venom. She would snap at him over trivial things, the way he chewed his food, the sound of his breathing as they sat together in the evenings. Nothing he did was ever right, and she made sure he knew it. Tom had long since learned to keep his distance, walking on eggshells to avoid setting her off, but it never mattered. She found reasons to lash out, to tear him down, to make him feel as small as she did. Even strangers weren't safe from Clara's wrath. If someone bumped into her on the street, she would glare at them, muttering insults under her breath. If a cashier was too slow or a server made a mistake, she would berate them loudly, making a scene just to assert her dominance. The satisfaction she felt in those moments was fleeting, a brief flicker of power that quickly faded, leaving her feeling even more hollow than before. Clara knew, deep down, that her anger was a mask for her own insecurities. She was terrified of being vulnerable, of admitting that she was unhappy, that she felt like a failure. So instead, she projected that hatred onto others, tearing them down in a desperate attempt to build herself up. But the more she lashed out, the more isolated she became, her world shrinking as people distanced themselves from her. In the end, Clara's anger consumed her, leaving her alone, bitter, and trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. She had pushed everyone away, and now, she was left with nothing but her own misery. Wrath's companion is ignorance. Ethan had always admired Claire. From the moment they met, he was captivated by her beauty, confidence, and charm. She seemed to glide through life with effortless grace, while he struggled to find his footing. Claire had a well-paying job at a prestigious marketing firm, a wide circle of friends, and a magnetic personality that drew people to her. Ethan, on the other hand, felt stuck in a dead-end job, awkward in social situations, and invisible next to her brilliance. At first, Ethan's admiration for Claire was genuine. He loved her deeply and was proud to be with someone so extraordinary. But over time, that admiration curdled into something darker. He couldn't help but compare himself to her, and every comparison left him feeling inadequate, small, and resentful. The envy gnawed at him, growing stronger with each passing day, but he refused to acknowledge it. He buried his insecurities deep inside, pretending everything was fine. He watched as Claire effortlessly charmed everyone she met, including men. Ethan began to imagine them noticing her in ways that he feared they never noticed him. The thought of her being admired, desired by others, drove him mad with jealousy. His mind spun scenarios of her with other men, each one more vivid and torturous than the last. He tried to push the thoughts away, to suppress the growing resentment, but it was like trying to hold back a flood. One evening, as they sat in their apartment, Claire was talking excitedly about a new project at work. Her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm, but all Ethan could see was the gulf between them. The thought hit him like a hammer: she's going to leave me. It was absurd, irrational, but he couldn't shake it. His mind spiraled, imagining her with a coworker, then another, each seemed more unbearable than the last. Something snapped inside him. A primal, desperate rage surged through his veins, drowning out all reason. Without thinking, he grabbed a heavy object from the table and struck her. Claire's eyes widened in shock and pain as she fell to the floor, the life draining from her. The apartment was deathly silent now, except for Ethan's ragged breathing. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but it brought no relief. Only horror. He had destroyed the one person he loved more than anything, driven by the very insecurities he had refused to confront. In a daze, he stumbled to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and ended his own life, falling beside her. Their lives, full of promise and potential, were extinguished in a moment of senseless, uncontrollable envy. The darkness inside Ethan had won, leaving nothing behind but a tragic, haunting void. The greener fields often appear so due to unique perspective. Mark and Lisa Collins were the epitome of success. They lived in a sprawling, modern house in an affluent neighborhood, drove luxury cars, and took vacations to exotic locations around the globe. Their home was filled with the latest gadgets, designer furniture, and walls adorned with expensive art. To anyone looking in from the outside, they had it all. But their lives, meticulously curated to reflect perfection, concealed a darker truth. Their 4 children, Sarah, Jacob, Emily, and Lucas, lived in the shadow of their parents' pride. Mark and Lisa provided for their every material need: expensive clothes, the latest electronics, and enrollment in prestigious private schools. But there was a stark emptiness in their lives, a void that no amount of wealth could fill. The children rarely saw their parents, who were either busy with work, entertaining clients, or planning their next lavish getaway. Mark and Lisa believed that by giving their children the best of everything, they were fulfilling their roles as parents. But they had long forgotten the importance of time spent together, of genuine affection, and the irreplaceable value of human connection. Family dinners were a rare occurrence, and when they happened, they were silent affairs. The children, having grown accustomed to their parents' indifference, had learned to keep to themselves. Sarah, the eldest, had become withdrawn, burying herself in books to escape the loneliness. Jacob turned to sports, seeking the camaraderie of his teammates that he never found at home. Emily, just entering her teenage years, became rebellious, desperate for attention in any form, while little Lucas, too young to understand, clung to his nanny, the only source of warmth in his life. Mark and Lisa, lost in their pride, failed to see the growing distance between them and their children. They mistook their success for fulfillment, believing that as long as they provided for their family materially, they were doing their duty. But the cracks in their perfect facade were widening, and the cost of their pride was becoming increasingly apparent. The Collins family was a microcosm of a society obsessed with wealth and status. In their pursuit of a picture-perfect life, they had sacrificed the very essence of what it means to be human, the need for love, empathy, and connection. Their home, filled with all the trappings of success, was devoid of warmth. In their relentless pursuit of material success, Mark and Lisa had lost the most precious thing of all, their family. But in their pride, they were too blind to see it. "At least you have your pride,"